In the middle of the night, halfway across the Atlantic, an Airbus A330 carrying 306 passengers and crew suddenly runs out of fuel. The lights go out, the oxygen masks drop, and the sound of the engines is replaced by an eerie silence. In pitch darkness, the huge aircraft begins to drift towards the ocean below. The pilots are stunned and try to glide the plane as far as possible. The flight attendants prepare the passengers for an emergency ditching into the sea, which is probably a death sentence for everyone on board. This is a living nightmare. But, incredibly, it never had to happen. Many accounts of this incident focus on the technical aspects, but that is only half the story. The truth is that this is a fascinating story about human psychology. It's a story about how people make decisions under pressure when faced with ambiguous information. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236. On the evening of August 23, 2001, 293 passengers and 13 crew members boarded an Air Transat Airbus A330 at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada. They were bound for Lisbon, Portugal, a 7-hour flight. Most of the passengers were holidaymakers looking forward to a few weeks in Portugal's sunny climate, but there were also many Portuguese nationals on their way home. Little did they know when they boarded the plane that night that a critical weakness in one of the engines would put them in grave danger halfway across the Atlantic. On the surface, the passengers should have had no cause for concern. The Airbus A330 was a state-of-the-art aircraft, with banks of computers feeding information from hundreds of onboard sensors to the pilots. Its systems were highly automated, and since its introduction 7 years earlier, it had established itself as one of the safest aircraft in the skies. The aircraft used for this flight was only 2 years old. Commanding the flight was 48-year-old Captain Robert Pichet. During his time as a pilot, he had accumulated more than 16,000 hours in a variety of aircraft, flying both land and seaplanes in the harsh climates of northern Canada. For an airline pilot, however, he had a rather unusual background. Before being hired by Air Transat, he had served 16 months of a 5-year prison sentence after being caught smuggling marijuana into the United States in a small plane. But everything in his eventful career would pale in comparison to the crisis that would unfold over the ocean that night. Joining Pichet in the cockpit was 28-year-old First Officer Dirk de Jager. He had around 5,000 hours of flying experience, including just under 400 hours on the A330. Although less experienced than the captain, he too had flown a variety of aircraft before training to fly the Airbus with Air Transat a year earlier. Both pilots had impeccable training and performance records with the airline. With the plane loaded with 48 tons of fuel for the Atlantic crossing and all passengers on board, Flight 236 pushed back from the gate at Toronto. It was 9 p.m. local time, and they expected to be in Lisbon in about 7 hours. All was routine as the captain taxied to the runway and started the engines for takeoff. Once airborne, the pilots turned the plane east and climbed to a cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. All was well on board for the first few hours. The passengers settled down to rest, as they were due to arrive in Lisbon in the early hours of the morning. On long-haul flights, there is not much for the pilots to do in the cockpit. Here is a copy of the cruise checklist used by the pilots on this flight. Their duties consisted mainly of checking fuel levels against the flight plan, providing position reports to air traffic control, as there is no radar over the oceans, and monitoring the aircraft's systems. All was routine in the cockpit for the first 4 hours as the plane raced across the Atlantic. But just after 5 GMT, when the flight was about halfway across the ocean, the pilots got an unusual reading on engine number 2, the engine on the right side of the plane. Their onboard computers told them that the oil pressure in the engine was high, the amount of oil was low, and the oil temperature was low. The pilots had never seen this combination of alerts before. Normally, engine oil temperatures rise during a flight, they don't fall. The pilots searched their flight crew operating manual, FCOM, to see if they could find an explanation for the unusual readings, but there was nothing in any of the manuals to explain this combination of readings. When this search turned up nothing, they radioed Air Transat's maintenance control center in Mirabel, Quebec, back in Canada. They relayed the unusual readings to the dispatcher, who said he would look into it and get back to them. In the meantime, the pilots continued to monitor the engine readings. There was no sign of trouble in the passenger cabin. Many of the passengers were asleep. They were about to get a rude awakening. About 30 minutes later, just after 5:30 GMT, an advisory message appeared on the ECAM, the central display in the cockpit. The pilots called up the fuel page on the ECAM and saw that there was a fuel imbalance between the tanks in the left wing and those in the right wing. A fuel imbalance is unusual, but generally not a cause for alarm. To correct the problem, the pilots opened the crossfeed valve, allowing fuel to flow from the left wing tank to the right wing tank. However, barely 10 minutes after the pilots had done this, the instruments showed that the total fuel on board had dropped below the level required to reach Lisbon. Now it was getting serious. They were halfway across the ocean and they weren't going to make it to Europe. Over the middle of the Atlantic, the pilots didn't have many options in terms of diversion airports. In fact, their only option was an airport in the Azores, a small string of Portuguese islands in the middle of the Atlantic. They set a course for Lajes Airport on the island of Terceira and informed Santa Maria Air Traffic Control that they were diverting due to a lack of fuel. At the time, the plane had just 7 tons of fuel on board. That may sound like a lot, but it's only 6% of the A330's total fuel capacity, and it was still falling much faster than usual. If the fuel readings were accurate, the situation for the crew was dire. The rapid rate of fuel loss shown on the instruments was entirely consistent with a massive fuel leak, but the pilots doubted that there was a fuel leak. For one thing, nothing had happened during the flight that would cause the plane to suddenly start leaking fuel. There were no bangs or noises, no severe turbulence, no lightning strikes, nothing. Fuel consumption for the first 4 hours had been perfectly normal. How could a new aircraft like this A330? Suddenly, during the quietest part of the flight, the plane began to lose fuel. The captain had asked the cabin crew to check for fluid coming off the wings or engines, but they had found nothing. Finally, the rate of fuel loss was so great, literally a ton of fuel every 5 minutes, that it seemed impossible. To have only 7 tons left halfway across the Atlantic, when every fuel check up to that point had been perfectly normal, was inconceivable. Both pilots concluded that it was far more likely that the fuel readings were simply incorrect. In fact, fuel leaks on passenger aircraft are so rare that neither pilot had been trained at any stage of their training to recognize and deal with them. There is a checklist for what to do in the event of a fuel leak, but this is a photocopy of the one the pilots of Flight 236 had on board at the time. But other than that, the pilots were simply not prepared to frame the problems they saw in terms of a fuel leak. In addition, they had already more or less concluded that the indications they had received earlier in the flight about the engine oil were probably wrong. In a complicated aircraft like the A330, bad data from faulty sensors is not an uncommon occurrence. So when the pilots saw that the fuel gauges were showing frankly unbelievably low fuel levels, they assumed that the gauges were also faulty. The tragic truth, of course, was that the pilots were right in thinking that both the engine oil and fuel gauges were related. However, unbeknownst to the pilots, the common factor explaining both was not a computer glitch, but a massive fuel leak in the right engine. Deep inside engine number 2, a vibrating hydraulic pipe had rubbed through the outer casing of a fuel line, rupturing it and causing fuel to gush into the engine at an alarming rate. This was the cause of both the odd-looking engine oil readings and the low fuel readings. The psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias played a crucial role. The crew's initial mental model of their situation was that the engine oil indications were the result of faulty sensors. When building a picture of the world or a mental model, people tend to act more like lawyers than scientists. They look for evidence that supports their case rather than evidence that might undermine it. Even when new evidence came in that suggested a fuel leak, such as the fuel imbalance and the signs of rapid fuel loss, the pilots failed to step back and reevaluate their original hypothesis. It is well known in psychology that this phenomenon is particularly strong under conditions of stress and high workload. The pilots were so busy talking to maintenance, going through checklists and coordinating the diversion with the cabin crew and air traffic control that they had little opportunity to reassess their understanding of the situation. Although fuel had been transferred from the left to the right tank minutes earlier, the imbalance between the two tanks remained. In fact, the aircraft was losing fuel at an astonishing rate. However, for the reasons just mentioned, the pilots couldn't quite believe that there was a fuel leak. Despite the high level of automation in the Airbus A330, there was no warning to indicate to the pilots that there was a fuel leak. The only way they could tell was by monitoring the rate of fuel loss in each tank. But just in case there was indeed a fuel leak in the right wing, the pilots switched on the right wing fuel pumps and switched off the left wing fuel pumps to reverse the direction of the crossfeed, so that fuel from the right wing tank was now being used to feed both engines. The crew then contacted Air Transat's maintenance control center again to report the inexplicably low fuel readings. At this point, the aircraft had only 4.8 tons of fuel on board instead of the 17 tons it should have had. During their conversation with maintenance control, the fuel level continued to drop. The pilots considered using the fuel leak procedure, but the captain ultimately decided against it. This was because the procedure required the pilots to descend to 20,000 feet. The captain reasoned that if there was indeed a fuel leak, descending would be a terrible idea, as running out of fuel at their current altitude of 39,000 feet was much better than running out of fuel at just 20,000 feet, which was almost half their current altitude. In the psychology of problem solving, the captain's decision not to carry out this procedure is explained by a phenomenon known as framing bias. When faced with decisions involving risk, people tend to frame their options in terms of gains and losses. In this case, the captain had to choose between a certain loss, descending to 20,000 feet, and a less likely but more catastrophic loss, staying at 39,000 feet and failing to detect a fuel leak. In these situations, people tend to choose the latter, riskier option. It's better to maybe have something terrible happen than definitely have something moderately bad happen. But any doubt was erased minutes later at 6:13 when the right engine flamed out. The captain immediately applied maximum thrust to the remaining engine and began to descend. With only one engine working, the aircraft could still fly, but not at 39,000 feet. Meanwhile, the first officer informed air traffic control that they had lost an engine and were descending. At this point, the crew had just 600 kilograms of fuel left. They were still 240 kilometers from the airport. It finally dawned on the pilots that they were truly in a life-or-death situation. The first officer declared an emergency to air traffic control. Then, 13 minutes later and still 120 kilometers from the airport, the left engine burst into flames. One of the most technologically advanced aircraft in the skies had been reduced to a giant glider. The loss of both engines meant that the plane had no electrical power. A fan, known as a ram air turbine, automatically deployed from under the fuselage. By spinning in the wind, it generated a small amount of electricity, which was used to power the captain's instruments and a few other critical systems. The captain had one task: to extend the glide path as far as possible in the hope of reaching the airport. The lives of all 293 passengers hung in the balance. The loss of power plunged the cabin into darkness, and with no engines, there was an eerie silence. The captain told the cabin crew to prepare the passengers for a water landing. This was essentially a death sentence for everyone on board. At night, with no way of seeing the water rushing towards them and with the great swells of the Atlantic Ocean, a crash landing in the sea would tear the fuselage apart. Any passengers who weren't killed by the impact would probably drown. Those few who survived the initial impact would soon succumb to hypothermia. So the choice that seemed to Captain Pichet, between ditching the plane in the sea and trying to glide to the airport, was a false one. In fact, his only hope was to glide to the airport, but in the middle of the night, with over 100 kilometers to go, the challenge was immense. This was no easy task. The plane was descending at 2,000 feet per minute, and at its current altitude of 30,000 feet, that meant that no matter what, the plane would be on the ground in 15 minutes. Whether it landed in the sea or on the runway was entirely in Captain Pichet's hands. With no engines to push air into the cabin began to depressurize. The oxygen masks fell and the passengers scrambled to put them on in time. The pilots also put on their oxygen masks. The captain had some experience of engine-out landings in smaller aircraft, but this was like nothing he had ever done before. It was night, he was 100 kilometers from the airport, and the A330 is far from a perfect aircraft. On the A330, as on all passenger aircraft, the engines don't just propel the plane forward, they also provide electrical and hydraulic power. The loss of both engines had knocked out several vital systems. First, the aircraft had lost 2 of its 3 hydraulic systems. These powered the stabilizer on the tail, making it more difficult for the captain to control the pitch of the aircraft. The aircraft had also lost most of its wing spoilers, nose wheel control, and engine thrust reversers. In other words, not only was the plane without engine power, but it was now harder to control in the air. If Piché managed to get the plane onto the runway, it would be harder to steer and harder to stop. At Liège, the tower controller began switching the runway lights on and off to show the pilots where the airport was. The crew could see it from afar, on the horizon, a lone point of light in the dark Atlantic. To keep the plane in the air as long as possible, the captain flew the descent at a speed between the recommended glide speed and the stall warning speed. If he got too high on approach, he could descend faster to lose speed, no problem. But if he got too low, there was no way to get that altitude back. He wanted to maintain as much altitude as possible during the descent, but there were a few more constraints that Piché had to deal with. He had to keep his speed above 140 knots, or the ram air turbine would stop producing power. At the same time, he couldn't go faster than 200 knots or the landing gear wouldn't extend. And because it was gliding, the only way to control its speed was to pitch the nose up or down. Behind him, 293 passengers were preparing for an ocean ditching. Flight attendants were instructing them to assume the restraint position. The cabin was deathly silent as the minutes ticked away. As the captain approached the airport, he saw that his attempts to keep the plane up had worked. Only they had worked too well, and now there was a new problem. The plane was too high. He was 8 miles out and still at 13,000 feet. On a normal approach, he would have been at about 3,000 feet at this point. If he made the approach now, he would have to make a steep descent, which would increase his airspeed to the point where a landing would be impossible. So, rather unnervingly, given the lack of engine power, Piché now had to put some distance between himself and the runway. He began a 360-degree turn to lose altitude. During this turn, the first officer lowered the gear and extended the slats on the front of the wings. This created extra lift, allowing the aircraft to fly more slowly without creating too much drag. This turn was an unsettling maneuver, as the plane was facing away from the airport for half of it. Finally, after 2 tense minutes, the captain brought the wings level as the runway came back into view. He was still high, but not high enough to make another 360-degree turn. So, as he approached the airport, he made a series of S-turns, banking the plane hard to the left and then hard to the right to put more distance between himself and the runway. At Liège, the full complement of emergency vehicles was dispatched to meet the aircraft on the runway. Firefighters and ambulances waited by the runway in preparation for the crash landing of a fully loaded A330. The first officer carefully monitored the aircraft's airspeed as the captain flew the final approach. Without flaps, they had to maintain a much higher airspeed than normal, about 200 knots compared to the usual 145 or so. The first officer called out airspeeds and altitudes to assist the captain as the runway came up to meet them. There would be no go-arounds or missed approaches. Piché had one chance to get the plane on the runway. Finally, the plane hit the runway hard. 8 of the 12 tires burst and the plane bounced before coming back down. The plane was extremely fast, and without most of its wing spoilers and no engine reverse thrust, it didn't slow down. In addition, the anti-skid system was inoperative, so when the captain slammed on the brakes, the wheels locked. The massive aircraft skidded down the runway, its tires worn to the rim. Finally, after a screeching landing, the plane skidded to a stop. All 306 people on board were safe. The captain ordered an evacuation, and all passengers managed to leave the plane within 90 seconds. Fires had started in the left main landing gear wheels, but these were quickly extinguished by the fire crews who were in position to meet the aircraft. The crew were initially given a hero's welcome. They had successfully completed the longest glide by a passenger aircraft in aviation history without any loss of life. But within days of the landing, questions were being asked about how the pilots had run out of fuel over the Atlantic in the first place. Why didn't they trust their instruments, which told them that the fuel was dropping much faster than normal? Dedicated investigators found that if the pilots had used any of the fuel loss procedures when they initiated the diversion to Lajes, whether it was the engine fuel loss procedure, the wing fuel loss procedure, or the fuel loss not located procedure, they would have landed at Lajes with at least 3.8 tons of fuel on board. But due to the psychological factors discussed earlier in this episode, such as confirmation bias and framing bias, as well as the lack of a fuel loss warning in the A330 software, the pilots never carried out these procedures. It didn't help that they had received no training from Air Transat on fuel loss and related procedures. As for the original source of the fuel leak, investigators found that maintenance had been carried out on the number 2 engine shortly before the accident flight. A technician had replaced a part of the engine with a part intended for another aircraft. As a result, a hydraulic line came into contact with a fuel line. On Flight 236, as the hydraulic line vibrated and pressed against the fuel tube, it ruptured, causing a massive fuel leak. While the final report stated that the pilot's failure to detect the fuel leak in time contributed to the aircraft running out of fuel, it also praised them for their handling of the situation once the engines had failed. Here's an extract from the final report: Approach and landing. The captain's handling of the aircraft during the descent and landing with the engines off was remarkable, given the stressful situation, the fact that it was night, that there were few instruments available, that pitch control was limited, and that he had never received training for this type of flight profile. It went on. The first officer provided full and effective support to the captain during the glide and successful landing. The year after the incident, both Piché and Yeager were awarded the Airline Pilots Association's Superior Airmanship Award in recognition of their exceptional skill in executing a dead-stick landing of an Airbus A330. They still hold the record for the longest glide of a passenger aircraft. As a result of this incident, Airbus introduced a new warning into its flight management computer, which alerts pilots when there is a high rate of fuel loss, indicating a fuel leak. Air Transat also provided its pilots with additional training on extended range operations, fuel management, and diversion procedures. These safety improvements mean that Piché and Yeager's record glide is likely to remain a record for a long time to come.